The sun set over Dubai, casting a golden glow over the Burj Khalifa. Amal al-Mansouri stood before the mirror in her luxury apartment, adjusting her diamond earrings. At 32, she was the epitome of the perfect Dubai wife, graceful, educated, and enviable. Her designer gown shimmered like liquid gold, more expensive than most people's cars. Yet there was a hollow emptiness in her eyes that no amount of wealth could fill. Her husband, Tariq al-Mansouri, stood nearby, his attention divided between her and his watch. At 38, Tariq had everything most men could only dream of: a thriving business empire, social prestige, and a beautiful wife. What he lacked, however, was the ability to see the woman withering behind the gilded walls of their perfect life. She was an accessory to his success, not a partner. The silence between them in their elevator ride was deafening. Amal thought about the painting she had left unfinished in her secret studio, the only space where she felt alive in the otherwise suffocating environment. Tonight, they were headed to the Amani Hotel for an exclusive charity event, one where Tariq's mentor, Sheikh Ahmed Alouyan, would be present. Tariq never missed an opportunity to be seen with the powerful business mogul. At the event, the ballroom glittered with Dubai's elite. Women adorned in haute couture and sparkling jewels, men in pristine dish dashes, their conversations laced with business deals worth millions. It was all part of the game, and Amal was an unwilling player. As she stood beside her husband, exchanging pleasantries, her thoughts wandered to the unfinished painting. The art was a piece of her soul, hidden from the world, and she longed to let it speak louder than the image of perfection she was forced to maintain. Then, across the room, she saw him, Sheikh Ahmed Alouyan. At 58, his salt and pepper beard and commanding presence made him the center of attention. When he saw Tariq, his face lit up with genuine warmth. "My friend," he said, embracing him, and then his gaze shifted to Amal, a look that lingered longer than was appropriate. "You look radiant tonight," he said with sincerity. Amal felt a stir in her chest, not because of attraction but because, for the first time in years, someone had actually seen her. Not the perfect wife, not the accessory, but her. It was a fleeting moment, but it ignited something inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Amal's nerves fluttered as she took a small sip of champagne, its bubbles biting at her tongue. Tariq was deep in conversation with a group of businessmen, the latest in a long line of networking opportunities. She stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the lights of the Amani Hotel ballroom reflected off the crystal chandeliers, casting a golden glow over the polished marble floors. Tariq's attention was elsewhere, absorbed in his own ambitions, while Amal's gaze wandered. It landed on Sheikh Ahmed Alouyan again. He was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, observing the crowd with the same calm authority that radiated from him. Despite his age, there was a magnetic energy about him, a confidence that made others gravitate toward him. As if on cue, Sheikh Ahmed's eyes met Amal's. For a moment, the world around her seemed to blur. He smiled, a knowing smile, and then made his way toward her. He greeted her with warmth, taking her hand in his grip firm yet gentle. "The lovely Amal," he said, his voice deep and rich, with a slight edge that made her heart beat faster. Her breath caught as she looked into his eyes, seeing something that wasn't the typical polite acknowledgement she received from others. It was as if he was seeing past the polished exterior, past the perfect wife, and into the person she had been hiding away. "You look stunning this evening," he added, his words far from empty flattery. Amal smiled politely, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you," she said, her voice betraying a hint of the vulnerability she felt. "It's a lovely event. I'm glad to contribute." "And contribute you have," Sheikh Ahmed replied, his eyes briefly scanning her figure before locking with hers again. "I didn't realize you were an artist." Amal blinked in surprise, momentarily unsure how to react. She had never spoken of her passion for painting to anyone, certainly not to someone like him. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. I make it my business to know about the people I invest in, he said smoothly, his words deliberate. Your artwork speaks volumes. It's a rare thing in a world so consumed by appearances. Her heart quickened at his words, and a small part of her, the part that had longed to be seen for who she truly was, began to stir. Before she could respond, Tariq returned, his phone buzzing with another business call. Amal entertained Sheikh Ahmed for a moment, he instructed curtly, already turning away. Amal smiled faintly at the abruptness of his exit. For the next few moments, she was alone with Sheikh Ahmed. The conversation flowed easily between them, about art, about ambition, about the sacrifices that people like her and Tariq made to maintain their positions. But as they spoke, Amal felt a growing sense of unease. She was no longer just a wife attending her husband's business affairs. She was a woman, finally being seen for the first time in years. Over the next few weeks, Amal's interactions with Sheikh Ahmed grew more frequent. Tariq was preoccupied with his business deals, and Amal found herself attending the art program at his invitation, ostensibly to discuss a new initiative. Each Wednesday, she made her way to the sunlit studio overlooking Dubai Creek, her heart sinking at the thought of her lonely nights spent waiting for a husband too busy to see her. The art program, she initially thought, would be just another charitable distraction, another of Tariq's casual connections. But as she spent more time there with Sheikh Ahmed and the other women, something changed. The weight she had carried for so long of being perfect, of fitting a role in a marriage that had become more of a contract than a connection, began to feel unbearable. Each brushstroke on her canvas, each conversation with Sheikh Ahmed, began to strip away layers of the facade she had built around herself. Sheikh Ahmed's attention was constant, but it was different from the hollow compliments she received from others. He didn't just look at her. He looked into her, observing details that others missed. The way her fingers trembled slightly when she picked up a brush, the way her smile would falter when she spoke of her work. Your technique has improved, he observed one afternoon, his voice low as he stood behind her, his breath warm against her neck. His proximity sent a jolt of discomfort through her, but there was no denying the thrill it brought. Tariq never seemed to notice the change in her, or if he did, he didn't care. His brief words of acknowledgement, usually followed by a distracted glance at his phone or a quick retreat to his work, made Amal feel more like an accessory than a partner. Her heartache, once tucked away, began to emerge in subtle ways. Late nights, restless thoughts, and the growing emotional distance between her and Tariq. Amal had become a woman in conflict with herself. The art program was meant to be a way to fill the void left by her loveless marriage, but it was also where her true desires began to surface. Sheikh Ahmed's presence felt like the spark to the fire she had long suppressed. One evening, after the others had left, Sheikh Ahmed approached her, standing closer than usual as he examined the painting she was working on. You've captured the essence of longing perfectly, he remarked, his voice softer now, almost intimate. She stiffened slightly but didn't pull away. It's nothing, she replied, but even she could hear the lie in her words. It wasn't nothing. It was everything. The space between them seemed to shrink, the silence stretching longer than it should have. There was an undeniable pull, an unspoken tension, but Amal, for once, didn't know how to resist. Amal stood in front of the mirror one morning, gazing at her reflection. The woman staring back at her seemed foreign, stiff, perfect, polished, and nothing like the woman she had once dreamed of being. The weight of her marriage to Tariq and the increasing emotional burden of her interactions with Sheikh Ahmed had started to take its toll. What was once an occasional emotional escape through her art had transformed into an overwhelming need. She wasn't just attending the program to pass the time anymore. She was actively seeking it out, desperate for the attention and connection she found in Sheikh Ahmed's presence. He had seen something in her from the very beginning. While Tariq never seemed to notice the cracks forming in their marriage, Sheikh Ahmed saw her. Not just her beauty, but the emptiness that ran deeper than the glossy surface she presented to the world. For the first time in years, Amal felt seen, truly seen. Sheikh Ahmed's words, though often coated in subtle praise, were weighted with deeper meaning. His gaze lingered on her too long, his compliments drawing her closer, like a moth to a flame. There was power in the way he spoke to her, in the way he treated her not just as a wife or a charity project, but as a person with depth, complexity, and desires. She had become addicted to the attention, the validation that Tariq no longer gave her. One afternoon, as she sat sketching in the studio, Sheikh Ahmed approached her from behind, his shadow falling over her canvas. His hand brushed hers as he guided her on her work, the touch lingering longer than necessary. "Do you know why I've always been so drawn to you?" he asked, his voice a soft murmur. Amal paused, heart hammering in her chest. She was unsure how to respond, unsure whether to flee from the undeniable attraction or surrender to it. She glanced up at him, meeting his gaze. His eyes were full of intensity, studying her with a kind of curiosity that made her feel both vulnerable and alive. "No," she replied quietly, though the truth was she already knew. It was the same reason she had continued to return to him, to feel desired, to feel like she mattered. Sheikh Ahmed stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "It's because you're a woman who understands the cost of perfection. And I can give you something better than perfection. Freedom. Freedom." The word lingered in her mind, sinking deep into her soul. For the first time in years, Amal considered what that word might truly mean. Freedom from the perfect life she had been expected to live. Freedom from the constraints of a marriage that was more of an obligation than a love story. As the days went on, Amal's internal battle intensified. Every time she saw Sheikh Ahmed, her resolve to resist him weakened. She told herself that she had no choice but to remain in her marriage, that she had to keep up appearances for the sake of her family's honor. But deep down, Amal knew she was beginning to crave the kind of love and recognition Sheikh Ahmed was offering. A love not bound by duty but by something far more dangerous: desire. The line between art and life blurred for Amal as she continued to spend more time with Sheikh Ahmed. Their weekly sessions in the sunlit studio had begun to feel more like secret meetings than art lessons. The emotional connection between them was undeniable, and despite her guilt, Amal found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't ignore. Each brushstroke, each quiet conversation between them, brought her deeper into a world she had never expected to enter. It started as an innocent compliment here, a lingering touch there. But soon, their interactions were laced with tension, an electricity in the air whenever they were alone. Sheikh Ahmed knew how to stir her passions, how to make her feel like she mattered more than anything else in that moment. He listened to her with a depth that Tariq never had, truly hearing her fears and dreams, validating her in ways that made her feel alive. The affair began quietly. One evening, after a particularly intense session at the studio, Sheikh Ahmed invited her to dinner. The soft candlelight, the music playing in the background. It was all too perfect, a scene that seemed pulled from a fantasy. She told herself it was just dinner, nothing more. But the more time she spent with him, the less she was able to resist. At the end of the night, Sheikh Ahmed leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that spoke of desire and something deeper, something more dangerous. For a moment, Amal hesitated, guilt washing over her. But then his hands cupped her face, and the rest of the world faded away. In that moment, Amal gave in, surrendering herself to the overwhelming emotion that had built between them. The days that followed were a whirlwind of secrecy. Every stolen glance, every quiet rendezvous in the studio, deepened the tension between her and Tariq. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine. The guilt gnawed at her, but the thrill of being wanted, truly wanted, overshadowed it all. At home, Tariq had begun to notice the subtle changes in her. He didn't understand what was happening, but the cracks in their marriage were starting to show. Amal grew more distant, her mind often lost in thoughts of Sheikh Ahmed and the escape he offered her. Tariq continued to dismiss her, oblivious to the growing emotional chasm between them. His business empire, his obsession with success, consumed him, leaving no room for her. But one night, as she lay beside him in their cold, silent bed. Amal knew the truth. Her marriage was dying. She had already stepped into a new world, one that promised freedom, passion, and a connection she had been starving for. And now there was no turning back. Amal's affair with Sheikh Ahmed wasn't just an escape. It was the beginning of her unraveling. She had become a woman torn between two worlds. The one that had been carefully constructed for her, and the one that was slowly pulling her into its depths. With each passing day, the lies became harder to keep, the guilt heavier to bear. But as her affair deepened, so did her desire to reclaim something she had lost, herself. Amal's affair with Sheikh Ahmed began to consume her. What once started as a subtle attraction turned into a full-fledged emotional and physical entanglement. She could no longer pretend that she was the dutiful wife, the perfect partner for Tariq. Every stolen moment with Sheikh Ahmed, every whispered conversation, peeled back layers of the life she had so carefully constructed. Tariq noticed the changes in her first. She was quieter at home, often lost in thought or distracted by texts and calls that were easily dismissed as work-related. She grew colder, her smiles more forced, as if she were living a life that wasn't truly hers. Yet Tariq, ever the businessman, was consumed by his empire. He didn't see the cracks forming beneath the surface of their marriage, too focused on his own ambitions to notice the subtle unraveling of his wife. The tension between them thickened. There were no longer moments of shared intimacy, no more laughter between them. Tariq became more distant, retreating into his business world, while Amal continued to meet with Sheikh Ahmed. The affair was no longer just about passion. It became a lifeline for Amal, a chance to feel seen, valued, and wanted. But the weight of her secret was unbearable. The guilt gnawed at her every time she shared a bed with Tariq. She couldn't escape the truth that she had betrayed him, but at the same time, the emotional validation she received from Sheikh Ahmed made her feel alive in ways she never had before. It was a twisted form of freedom, one that came at the cost of her marriage, her integrity, and eventually her soul. Amal's inner conflict deepened. As she spent more time with Sheikh Ahmed, the lines between right and wrong blurred. She had longed for a love that Tariq couldn't give her, and now that she had found it, she was unsure how to navigate the consequences. She was trapped in her own lies, knowing that her affair was slowly suffocating her. The emotional toll was immense. The guilt, the fear of being found out, and the realization that she had fallen into a trap of her own making became overwhelming. The tipping point came when she couldn't keep the facade up any longer. Tariq caught a glimpse of the truth one evening, when he found a sketch of Sheikh Ahmed, her lover, in the art studio. The sketch was innocent enough, a study of a man, a figure she admired, but it was enough to send Tariq into a spiral of disbelief. It was the first real clue that something was amiss. Tariq confronted Amal, his face a mixture of rage and hurt. He demanded answers, but Amal could only offer silence. She knew the truth, but the truth had become too painful to speak. She had allowed herself to be consumed by the affair, and now there was no escape. The confrontation left them both shaken, but it was the beginning of the end for Amal. Tariq had seen the cracks, and his suspicions about her emotional distance were now confirmed. The guilt and shame weighed heavily on Amal, and as she looked into her husband's eyes, she realized that everything she had built was crumbling. The affair had turned into something much darker, and the consequences of her betrayal would change everything. The tension between Amal, Tariq, and Sheikh Ahmed had been building for months. Amal's secret life was no longer something she could hide. Tariq's suspicions grew sharper, and Sheikh Ahmed, with his manipulative charm, pushed her deeper into a corner. But no one truly understood the depth of Amal's internal struggle. The perfect wife, the perfect image. She had built this life on the promises of duty, family, and tradition. But behind the designer gowns and smiling faces, Amal was suffocating. The final confrontation happened one evening after an art exhibit that Sheikh Ahmed had invited Amal to. It was the first time she was truly alone with him after months of flirtation, stolen moments, and intimate exchanges. Tariq, as usual, was distracted by work, business deals that needed his attention. His absence, ironically, made Amal's decisions clearer. When Amal returned from the exhibit, she was late, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. Tariq was waiting for her in their luxurious living room, the tension palpable in the air. The question lingered, "What are you doing, Amal?" His voice broke through the silence like a harsh thunderstorm. He knew. He had suspected for too long, but now he had the evidence. Photos, phone records, everything. Tariq had been putting the pieces together. Amal's guilt hit her like a wave, but she couldn't lie anymore. Amal could only look at him, tears welling up in her eyes. "Tariq," she began, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Her words were empty, meaningless in the face of everything she had broken. She had failed him, but more importantly, she had failed herself. The rage in Tariq's eyes was unmistakable. "You think you can hide this from me? You think you can destroy everything we built, everything I've worked for?" He slammed his fist on the table, the force echoing in the room. Sheikh Ahmed's shadow loomed over them both. Tariq, in his desperate need to protect his empire, made a fateful decision. He stormed out, the weight of his betrayal and broken trust too much to bear. In his absence, Amal finally understood the depth of her situation. But her confrontation with Tariq was only the beginning. Sheikh Ahmed, ever the predator, saw the crack in her resolve and moved in for the final strike. He knew what she needed, a sense of validation, an escape from the life she had been trapped in. He had manipulated her long enough. Now he wanted to control the narrative. Amal was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. She had loved Tariq once, but now, in the midst of betrayal and deceit, love felt like a distant memory. Sheikh Ahmed's presence, his words, his touch, offered a tempting escape from the misery. He promised her freedom. Freedom from her suffocating marriage, from the lies, from the guilt. But the price was steep. She could feel it, the pull of darkness, the cost of losing herself in a dangerous game of power. By the time Amal made her decision, it was too late. She had already crossed a point of no return. The affair, the lies, the manipulation, it had all built to this final, inevitable confrontation. The truth, hidden beneath layers of deception, would come crashing down. As she looked into Sheikh Ahmed's eyes that night, Amal understood the horrifying reality. She had become a pawn in a game far bigger than her. Her choices had led her to this moment, and there was no escape. The confrontation she had tried to avoid had arrived, and with it came the painful realization that her life was no longer her own. The next few days were a blur of empty luxury, shattered dreams, and deceit. Amal's absence in the house was deafening. The tension between her and Tariq had escalated to an irreparable point. His heart raced with the memory of her last words, his mind replaying the final moments with her like an agonizing loop. He never imagined that things would come to such a tragic end. His wife, the woman he had once loved, had disappeared. Not physically, but emotionally and mentally. Amal's death came swiftly and violently, much like the tragedy she had found herself trapped in. She had gone to Sheikh Ahmed's palace for what was supposed to be another art discussion, an innocent excuse to spend time away from the chaos that had engulfed her life. But what Tariq didn't know, what no one knew, was that the affair had escalated beyond manipulation and power games. It had reached a point where Amal's escape seemed impossible, and her existence felt dispensable. The police arrived at the palace too late. By the time they found her lifeless body, the narrative was already set in motion. According to Sheikh Ahmed, Amal had tragically fallen while admiring one of the sculptures. The story was flawless. The witnesses, his staff, the perfectly orchestrated scene, it all aligned to protect him. No one questioned the impeccable alibi he had crafted. No one suspected foul play except for one man, Tariq. As he stood in the cold, sterile hallway of their home, the weight of his betrayal crushed him. Amal was gone. She was dead, and he had never truly understood her. Tariq couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. Something was off. Her death had been framed as an accident, but the events leading up to it, Her sudden emotional distance, the art program, the growing closeness with Sheikh Ahmed, told a different story. He found the journal later, hidden in Amal's studio, where she had documented everything. Her affair, her growing fears, the threats from Sheikh Ahmed, and her own desire to escape from a life that had long since become a cage. As he read the pages, the horror of it all settled in. Tariq had been blind, so consumed with his empire, his image, that he had failed to see the woman behind the facade. And now it was too late. The journal held the truth, but even as he grasped the gravity of what had occurred, he was paralyzed by guilt. The woman he had failed to understand, the woman who had trusted him with her heart, was gone. And now he was left with nothing but broken pieces of a life he had never truly cherished. The revelations shattered Tariq's world. His empire, his reputation, his status, all the things he had worked so hard for, built on the back of his marriage, seemed meaningless now. His marriage was a farce, and Amal's death was the price of his ignorance. In the days that followed, Tariq's grief turned into a quiet fury. The guilt gnawed at him constantly, but it was a new feeling that stirred within him. Anger at the man who had taken his wife's life, manipulated her into a corner, and discarded her when she no longer served his purpose. Tariq realized he could not let this go. He could not let Sheikh Ahmed, the man who had lured his wife into a dangerous game of power and control, walk away unscathed. Tariq knew he would stop at nothing to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The battle for justice, for Amal's dignity, had just begun, and in his heart, he knew he could no longer be the man he once was. The perfect husband, the perfect image, those things no longer mattered. He was determined to expose the monster that had destroyed his wife, and with every ounce of strength he had left, he would seek justice for Amal, even if it meant sacrificing everything he held dear. Tariq could not rest. The weight of Amal's death pressed on him like a suffocating blanket, and the guilt gnawed at his very core. His mind raced, replaying every moment of their marriage, every interaction, and every subtle hint that he had missed. How had he not seen it? How had he not realized that his wife was slowly suffocating under the weight of her own despair? Amal's journal was his first glimpse into the dark truth of their lives. He could still feel the coldness of the paper as he turned each page. The words, written with such raw honesty, painted a picture of a woman trapped by her own desires and the suffocating grip of a man who had stolen her freedom. Sheikh Ahmed's name was written in bold, as though his presence had become the shadow under which Amal had withered. Tariq's blood boiled at the thought of his wife, his beautiful, talented wife, being manipulated by someone like him, someone who took pleasure in exploiting the vulnerable. But it wasn't just Sheikh Ahmed's manipulation that angered him. It was his own blindness. He had been so wrapped up in his empire, in the world he had built, that he had failed to see the woman who stood beside him. The woman who had once filled his life with warmth and light, and whom he had taken for granted. Tariq now understood that Amal's happiness, her sense of self, had been a casualty of his own indifference. But now she was gone. And with her, all his pretense of control and success crumbled. Amal's death had shattered the world he had so carefully constructed. He was left with nothing, except for a thirst for justice. And that thirst, that burning need to avenge his wife's life, consumed him. Tariq set out to gather every shred of evidence that could expose Sheikh Ahmed for the monster he truly was. He started making connections, reaching out to those who could help him. He had the journal, but now he needed more. Witnesses, documents, anything that could bring Sheikh Ahmed down. It was no longer about his reputation or his business. It was about making sure that the man who had destroyed Amal's life would pay for his actions. Days turned into weeks as Tariq became obsessed with uncovering the truth. He visited Amal's studio again, retracing her steps, staring at the paintings she had left behind. Paintings that seemed to tell a story of a woman torn between two worlds. His world and the world she had created in secret with Sheikh Ahmed. The deeper he dug, the more he discovered a web of lies, deceit, and manipulation that stretched far beyond what he had imagined. But there was one thing Tariq hadn't anticipated: the lengths to which Sheikh Ahmed would go to protect his empire. As Tariq gathered evidence, he found himself in a dangerous game of cat and mouse, with Sheikh's influence reaching into every corner of Dubai's elite circles. His contacts began to withdraw, his business dealings began to crumble, and his own family turned against him. Tariq had no choice but to go to the one place where he could find true justice: a meeting with the elders of Dubai's old guard. The weight of tradition and honor that had once been an abstract concept now became Tariq's last hope. If he could bring Sheikh Ahmed to the elders, if he could make them see the truth, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could bring justice to Amal's name. Tariq knew he had to move quickly. Time was running out, and Sheikh's power was a force that could crush him in an instant. But for the first time since Amal's death, Tariq felt a sense of purpose. This fight, this pursuit of justice was no longer about revenge. It was about ensuring that his wife's legacy was not one of silence, but one of truth. He would make sure that Sheikh Ahmed's reign of terror came to an end. Tariq's decision to confront Sheikh Ahmed was no longer a mere plan. It had become an inevitability. The elders, the men who upheld the ancient codes of honor in Dubai, were his last hope. In the heart of Dubai's sprawling skyline, amidst the glitzy towers and luxurious facades, the elders still held the power to deliver justice where modern institutions failed. But Tariq was uncertain. He had no idea how Sheikh Ahmed would respond, or if the elders would even side with him. But what choice did he have? Amal was dead, and her legacy, her truth, needed to be known. The meeting was set for midnight, and Tariq arrived with the heavy weight of his wife's memory on his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly as he entered the room where the 8 elders were gathered in a dimly lit chamber, their faces hard and unreadable. Sheikh Ahmed, ever the polished businessman, sat across from them, his posture confident, his eyes scanning the room with practiced indifference. Tariq's heart pounded as he stepped forward, his evidence in hand: the photos, the recordings, the testimony of those who had seen Amal's suffering firsthand. As he placed each item on the table, the elders listened in silence. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. This was no longer about his business or his status. This was about his wife, the woman he had failed to see, and the man who had manipulated her for his own desires. Sheikh Ahmed's face grew darker with each revelation. His calm facade started to crack as the evidence mounted. The room was still, the only sound the shuffle of papers as Tariq meticulously laid out the facts. The shaking hands, the bruises on Amal's arms, the late-night meetings. Each piece of the puzzle fell into place. Sheikh Ahmed, once a figure of power and influence, now seemed smaller, less invincible. His mask of control was slipping. Tariq could see it. The once proud and untouchable businessman, who had preyed on the vulnerable, now faced a reckoning. The final blow came when the elders turned to Sheikh, their eyes hard with judgment. The patriarch of the council, an older man whose wisdom was sought after across the region, addressed him. "You have brought shame not only upon your family but upon our city," he said. "The woman you used, Amal al-Mansuri, was your victim, but you are the true disgrace." Sheikh Ahmed's face twisted in anger, but it was a hollow, defeated kind of rage. The elders had made their decision. In the traditional way, they delivered their judgment. A massive financial compensation to Amal's family, the dissolution of his key business holdings, and the forced exile to a remote family compound. His social standing would be stripped, and his reputation would be permanently tainted. Tariq watched as the man who had once held the reins of power was reduced to nothing. It was a moment of vindication, but not one that brought him peace. The cost of justice had been high. Amal's death was still a hole in his heart, and no amount of revenge could ever fill it. As the meeting concluded, Tariq left the elders' chamber with a heavy heart. He had won, yes, but at what cost? The man who had destroyed his wife's life was now a shadow of his former self. But Amal was still gone. The truth had been uncovered, but it had come at the price of innocence and peace. Tariq's victory, though hard-won, was not the relief he had imagined. As he stood on the balcony of his home, overlooking the sprawling city of Dubai, he felt nothing but emptiness. The sun set, casting a warm glow over the skyline, but the light only served to accentuate the void left in his heart. Amal was gone, and no amount of wealth or status could ever replace her. The confrontation with Sheikh Ahmed, though it had shattered the man's empire, had only deepened the chasm of loss. Days passed, and the noise of the battle seemed to fade, but Tariq couldn't shake the weight of his actions. Despite the public victory, the betrayal he had witnessed of his wife, his marriage, and his own blind ignorance could not be erased. The journal Amal had left behind, the carefully documented evidence of the affair and Sheikh Ahmed's manipulations, was a reminder of everything he had failed to see in her. And now, the city that had once felt like home seemed foreign, its golden streets tarnished by the dark secrets it harbored. Amal's family, though comforted by the compensation and the dismantling of Sheikh Ahmed's empire, too felt the weight of her death. They couldn't embrace Tariq as they once had. Their grief was too raw, and their anger, though muted, simmered beneath the surface. Tariq had failed to protect Amal, and they couldn't forget that. Even in her absence, Amal's legacy remained tangled with their own sense of dishonor, now compounded by her tragic end. Sheikh Ahmed, once the pillar of Dubai's elite, retreated into exile, his influence and wealth disbanded. He would live out his days far from the glittering city he had once ruled, his name now whispered in the corridors of power, a cautionary tale. But even as his empire crumbled, his grip on the system had left deep scars. Tariq knew this well. Nothing in Dubai was ever truly gone. Those who had controlled the strings would always find new ways to weave them, and the damage done to Amal's life was irreversible. Tariq visited her grave often, sitting quietly beside the headstone, speaking to her as if she could hear him. He had failed her in life, and now in death, he would do everything he could to preserve her memory. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow, a cold victory that could never bring back the woman who had once been his everything. His mind often returned to the last conversation they had, the anger, the accusations, the final words that she had spoken before she was taken from him. Though he now lived in the shadow of her loss, Tariq's resolve hardened. He had fought for the truth, for Amal's dignity, and for justice in a city where corruption ran deep. And yet, the bitter truth lingered. Justice, in the end, had come too late. As the years pass, Amal's death remains a haunting reminder of the fine line between ambition and destruction, love and betrayal. The echoes of her life, her dreams, her art, and the silent struggle she endured are woven into the fabric of Dubai's elite society, where appearances often mask the darkest truths. Tariq's journey, filled with regret and an attempt at redemption, is a testament to the human capacity to learn from tragedy. His final moments with Amal, their confrontation, and the painful realization of his role in her demise, serve as a call to action for anyone who believes that power and privilege can shield them from the consequences of their actions. Amal's story may have ended in sorrow, but it serves as a powerful reminder that justice is not always swift, but it is necessary. As we reflect on the price of perfection and the lies we live by, let this story inspire us to look beyond the surface, challenge the status quo, and strive for a world where the truth is not buried and voices are heard. No matter how difficult the journey may be, take action. Stand for what's right even when the cost is high. Speak up for those whose stories are hidden in the shadows. Together, we can make a difference.